This is Audible.
Highbridge, a division of recorded books, presents Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World, by Tim Whitmarsh. Read by James Langton. Preface. This book is about atheists in the ancient world, primarily in Greece, their ideas, their innovations, their battles, their persecution. It is a work of history, not of proselytism. It is not my aim to prove the truth, or indeed falsehood, of atheism as a philosophical position. I do, however, have a strong conviction, a conviction that has hardened in the course of the researching and writing of this book, that cultural and religious pluralism and free debate are indispensable to the good life. A dialogue. Thersander. The gods are dead. Their withered bodies lie immolated on the altars of science and reason. The pious are exposed for credulous fools. Diotimus. Nonsense. Belief in the gods is stronger than ever. It is true, of course, that the peacocks of the Academy deceive themselves that their worldly knowledge is all. But you should get out into the streets, leave behind your chattering dinner parties, and take a walk through the city. The shrines are packed, the temples blackened with the smoke of sacrifice. Thersander. Their belief is skin deep. They act this way because they have always done so, not out of deep conviction. They do not have the time or inclination to question. They are too busy trying to survive, while their foolish leaders pitch them from one disaster to another. Diotimus. The people need their gods in this perilous world of ours. It is their comfort and stay. Thersander. Yes, of course, religion offers comfort and hope, but it also makes for anxiety and fear. It plays on the emotions of the credulous. It has nothing to do with truth. Only observation, testing, and rational inquiry can lead us to proper understanding. Diotimus. You blind yourself to the truth. That is not of this world. It is obvious that humans are born capable of glimpsing the divine. All people have that capacity, even if some choose not to use it. That is why there has never been and never will be a society without gods. Thersander. Humans created gods. Primitive humans saw divinity in the sun, moon, and stars, in the cycles of the seasons. They lacked scientific understanding of matter, the cosmos, and nature. In time, politicians and rulers realized the power of religious belief and cynically twisted it to their own ends. There are no gods overseeing social order, punishing wrongdoing. That is simply what our leaders teach us, to keep us in check. Diotimus. Atheism is a fad. Future generations will look back on it as a passing folly. Thersander. Quite the opposite. It is religion that is dying. It has no answers to the questions of the modern world, only adherence to outdated dogma and ritual. I know that belief in the gods is deeply rooted, and those who profit from it will fight tooth and claw to preserve it. But as true understanding of the world grows and spreads, it will be exposed for the vanity that it is. This dialogue between a religious devotee and an atheist intellectual in Athens at the end of the 5th century BC did not take place. But it could have done. All of the ideas in it are to be found in ancient Greek sources. If the terms of the debate seem arrestingly modern, that is no coincidence. We are still, in the 21st century, grappling with issues that are at least 2.5 millennia old. Atheism, we are so often told, is a modern invention, a product of the European Enlightenment. It would be inconceivable without the twin ideas of a secular state and a science as a rival to religious truth. This is a myth nurtured by both sides of the new atheism debate. Adherents wish to present skepticism toward the supernatural as a result of science's progressive eclipse of religion, and the religious wish to see it as a pathological symptom of a decadent Western world consumed by capitalism. Both are guilty of modernist vanity. Disbelief in the supernatural is as old as the hills. Already in the 4th century BC, Plato imagines a believer chastising an atheist. "You and your friends are not the first to have held this view about the gods. There are always those who suffer from this illness in greater or lesser numbers." We may balk at his disease imagery, but Plato was surely right in his general point. There have been many throughout history and across all cultures who have resisted belief in the divine. It is of course undeniable that religion has dominated human culture as far back as we can trace it. The problem lies with the normative claims built on that observation. Too often religious practice is imagined to be the regular state of affairs, needing no explanation, whereas any kind of deviation is seen as weird and remarkable. This view underpins the modernist mythology. The post-Enlightenment West is seen as exceptional, completely unlike anything else that has preceded it, and unlike anything elsewhere in the world. This is a dangerous misprision. To the religious it can suggest that belief is somehow universal, essential to the human condition, and that creeping secularism is an unnatural state. Atheists, on the other hand, can be seduced into delusional self-congratulation, as if 21st century middle-class Westerners have been the only people throughout history capable of finding problems with religion. Religious universalism, the idea that belief in gods is the default setting for human beings, is everywhere in the modern world. There is a growing trend towards speaking of religion as ingrained or even hardwired into the human subject. So-called neurotheologists have even sought to identify a part of the brain, the so-called God spot, where religious impulses originate. Others have argued that the human propensity toward religion emerged as an evolutionary advantage. These are controversial claims, and fortunately it is not our job to evaluate them here. The crucial point is that they can all be taken to buttress the normative view of religion. They project the idea that supernatural belief is fundamental to humanity. They follow Karen Armstrong in redefining Homo sapiens as Homo religiosus. Such views have their modern roots in the ideas of European theorists of natural religion, like Jean-François Lafitau, who aimed to demonstrate that all peoples have the innate potential for Christianity, and hence to legitimate the missionary project. They were, however, already seeded in the religious revolutions of late antiquity. The notion that a human is an essentially religious being, however, is no more cogent than the notion that apples are essentially red. When most of us think of an apple, we imagine a rosy glow, because that is the stereotype that we have grown up with. Picture books, folk songs, Disney cartoons, and television advertising have conspired to generate this normative picture of appleness, and indeed it is true enough that many apples are tinctured with red. But it would be ludicrous to see a golden delicious as less than apple-y just because it is pure green. Yet this is in effect what we do to atheists in acquiescing to the modernist mythology. We treat them as human beings who are not somehow complete in their humanity, even though they are genetically indistinct from their peers. We connive in the etymological quirk that identifies them only by their lack, of that sense of God, theos, that is assumed to be the norm. There are atheists the world over, not just in the industrialized West. The evidence for this is unmissable, since many states, including among others Afghanistan, Iran, Mauritania, Malaysia, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan, seek them out and execute them. Anthropologists, too, have found plenty of evidence for skeptics in non-Western cultures. Sir Edward Evans Pritchard, researching among the Azandi of the Congo in the early 20th century, spoke to one man who thought the witch doctors to be frauds. After probing a little further, Evans Pritchard concluded that this was the general attitude of the people. It is not strange or exceptional to adopt a skeptical approach toward the supernatural. Anyone in any culture at any time can do so. Such people do not always show up in the standard accounts of the religious culture of a given society, however, because the standard ethnographies are normative ones. they tend to project religion as not just uniform within a particular cultural group, but even constitutive of it. When we want to capture the essence of a given community, we typically ask about their religious systems. Zoroastrians believe that. Yoruba believe that. This cultural flattening creates a false impression of uniformity. Just as atheism exists cross-culturally, it also, as Plato rightly says, exists throughout history. A thoughtful study by John Arnold of Birkbeck College in the University of London, for instance, has explored the position of the unbelievers in medieval Christian Europe, arguing that the idea of a single unified faith community is a mirage. There was a spectrum of faith, belief, and unbelief. If we shift our attention away from ecclesiastical texts, which are specifically designed to perpetuate the idea of doctrinal unity, and toward religious life as it was actually practiced, we can find all sorts of cases of disbelief. Arnold cites, for instance, the case of one Thomas Taylor of Newbury, who was punished in 1491 for calling pilgrims fools, denying the power of prayer, and doubting the survival of the soul into the afterlife. The history of atheism matters. It matters not just for intellectual reasons, that is, because it behooves us to understand the past as fully as we can, but also on moral, indeed political grounds. History confers authority and legitimacy. This is why authoritarian states seek to deny it to those they do not favour, destroying historic sites and outlawing traditional practice. Atheist history is not embodied in buildings or rituals in quite the same way, but the principle is identical. If religious belief is treated as deep and ancient, and disbelief as recent, then atheism can readily be dismissed as faddish and inconsequential. Perhaps even the persecution of atheists can be seen as a less serious problem than the persecution of religious minorities. The deep history of atheism is then in part a human rights issue. It is about recognizing atheists as real people deserving of respect, tolerance, and the opportunity to live their lives unmolested. Atheism, in my opinion, is demonstrably at least as old as the monotheistic religions of Abraham, which means at least as old as the monotheism of Israel. That claim raises a separate question, since the processes whereby the temple cult in Jerusalem adopted Yahweh as their one God were complex and long-lived, and are not fully understood. I am persuaded by those who see monotheism in the biblical form that we know it today as shaped by the returning Israelite exiles in the Second Temple period, in the aftermath of the conquests of the Persian king Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. This is around the time when we find in Greece the first philosophical articulations of skepticism toward traditional religion, in the writings of Xenophanes of Colophon, circa 570 to 475 BC. But the exact dates do not greatly affect my point, which is rather a rhetorical one, that atheism has a tradition that is comparable in its antiquity to Judaism, and considerably older than Christianity or Islam. The difficulty in telling the story of atheism in deep antiquity, however, is that the evidence is often complex and elusive. It is very hard to locate the atheists in many ancient cultures. We do not find them in Ugaritic royal literature, or in the Hebrew Bible, say, nor indeed would we expect to. In their different ways, both bodies of text are strongly normative. Their role is to present a view of the world in which the existing social order is fixed and guaranteed by divine mandate. There are, to be sure, some traces in the Bible of awareness that not everyone commits equally to belief in Yahweh. The Psalms speak of wicked men who say that there is no God. Chapter 10, verse 4, chapter 14, verse 1. Job abuses Yahweh, quite understandably in the circumstances, for his capricious cruelty. The book of Job as a whole, perhaps, creates room for an attitude of suspicion and doubt toward the divine. But these are slender pickings. As a rule, this type of literature exists to insist on the incontrovertible truth of a divinity that favours its own acolytes. In the Western world, It is only for ancient Greece and later Greek-influenced Rome that the scattered tesserae can be pieced together into a coherent mosaic. Ancient China also had its atheists, but that would be a different story. This is in part because vastly more material survives in Greek than in all other ancient languages, including Latin, put together. Indeed, I would wager that more words survive, written by the Greek medical writer Galen alone, than of the literature of ancient Sumer, Babylon, Egypt, and Israel combined. Add in the huge amount of material culture, art, stone inscription, and papyrus that Greece generated over a 1,000-year period, and we can begin to get a sense of why the documentation for the inhabitants of this small peninsula and its diaspora is so much richer. But it is not simply a question of density of evidence. Greece has bequeathed a diversity of material that is so unfortunately lacking for other ancient peoples. As well as the official record, as it were, Greek historians have the outtakes and the alternative versions. Greek history tells us about eccentrics, deviants, miscreants, and skeptics. History is, so we are often told, written by the winners. Much of the labour of social history, from the mid-20th century onward, has been directed toward recovering the voices of those who do not loom large in the dominant script: women, slaves, children, the infirm, minorities. This book, by contrast, deals with a relatively small segment of ancient society. Most of those named were educated males from the upper tiers of Greek and Roman life, not because atheism is an exclusively elite male prerogative, but because that narrow demographic sliver is disproportionately represented in our sources. Yet they, too, have often been airbrushed out of ancient history, or their significance minimized. Accounts of Greek religion and culture have almost always been written from the point of view of the believers. The result is a misleading impression of ancient religion as a smoothly functional system, with no glitches. It is time to restore the other partners in the dialogue to life. Why has history been written in this way, so as to favour religion? The answer is not straightforward. It is true enough, certainly, that some modern scholars have allowed their own religious values to percolate into their writing about antiquity. Even today, scholarly discussions of ancient atheism can prompt undignified tirades against populist, fundamentalist atheism and its zealous preachers. Classical scholars, however, are not usually known for their piety. Quite the opposite. They have usually liked to see themselves as fiercely secular. The discipline of classics, as we know it today, indeed, emerged in the 19th century as a result of a messy divorce from theological studies. Since then, historians of Greek religion have sought to define it by contrast with the monotheistic religions of the modern West, and particularly Christianity. But this itself has been part of the problem. So keen have classicists been not to avoid Christianizing the Greeks, a cardinal offence in the Academy, that the standard textbooks have tended to describe Greek polytheism as in effect a straightforward inversion of modern Christianity, particularly in its Protestant guise. Focused on collective ritual rather than individual contemplation, the public sphere rather than the private self, outward performance rather than inner belief, conformity to past practice rather than scripture. There is much in this portrait that is true, but rigid schematic oppositions can be deeply misleading. It is demonstrably wrong to suggest that Greek religion was unproblematically embedded, to use the scholarly parlance, in society, fully naturalized in all of the day-to-day rhythms of the ancient city, to the extent that no ancient could imagine a world without religion. This view has been buttressed by a tendency to use official state inscriptions as the main sources for the history of Greek religion. Some of the reasons for this are perfectly sound. Whereas literary texts give us the perspectives of individuals, often hyper-educated and hyper-privileged, the inscriptions found all over the Greek-speaking world often record decisions made collectively. They are better evidence for what groups as a whole thought. Yet there is a downside too. Official inscriptions, naturally, give the official, ideologically sanctioned versions of events. They tend to promote the fiction that societies work smoothly and seamlessly. It is, then, hardly a surprise that ancient inscriptions barely mention heterodox views of the gods. Normative sources will only ever paint a normative picture of a society. Imagine a history of 21st century British politics that relied solely on the parliamentary records in Hansard. It would tell you much about the institutional workings of Westminster government, but very little of the complex diversity of attitudes and practices of real people. Not all inscriptions, however, are of this public kind. One intriguing case tells precisely of a ritual malfunction when someone refused to believe. In around 320 BC, a number of dedications were set up to the healing god Asclepius near his shrine at Epidaurus, a small town in the Peloponnese. Among them is the case of a man who lost the strength in his fingers. Arriving at the sanctuary, however, he mocked the other stories of miracle cures inscribed there and refused to believe in them. When he slept in the sanctuary, a common type of ritual activity known as incubation, Asclepius appeared to him in a dream. His fingers were cured, but the god chided him. "Because you disbelieved things that are not unbelievable, your name from now on shall be disbeliever, apistos." Aside from the story's wonderful self-consciousness, a miracle inscription about someone who didn't believe in miracle inscriptions, it also provides precious evidence for religious skepticism in practice, as espoused by a regular everyday Greek. Nothing is known about his social background, but there is no reason to assume that he was wealthy. Certainly the inscription itself is of a pretty rudimentary type, the language lacking in any grand rhetorical pretension. Of course, because it is a temple inscription, this is a morality tale, and the disbeliever gets his comeuppance. But surely the initial reactions of apistos must have been relatively common. It does not require a post-Enlightenment mentality to come up with the idea that miraculous stories of divine salvation are open to suspicion. Miracles, by their very definition, test the limits of plausibility. Greeks could see that just as well as Evans, Pritchard's Zandi. There is a comparable story told of Diogenes the Cynic, Greek philosophy's most subversive wit. It is said that while another man was marvelling at a series of temple dedications put up by survivors of sea storms, Diogenes retorted that there would have been many more if the non-survivors had also left dedications. The one-liner's subtext is that miraculous experiences have nothing to do with divine intervention and the power of prayer, and everything to do with the normal laws of statistical probability. Like Apistos before his dream, Diogenes believes the miracle stories. Indeed, Diogenes' central point is in effect the same as mine, that officially sanctioned religious records only tell you when worship seems to work, and excise all evidence to the contrary. In this book, I seek to tell the story of Greek atheism over a 1,000-year period, against the backdrop of huge historical changes, the emergence of Greece from its dark ages into a world of literate city-states, the development of citizenship and democracy, the conquests of Alexander the Great and the fragmentation of his empire, the subsuming of the Greek-speaking world into the Roman Empire, and finally the arrival of Christianity. The Christianization of the classical world did not happen overnight, nor was it a uniform process. There were many different varieties of Christianity, each with its own conflicted relationship to the Greek intellectual tradition that preceded it. Even so, despite this fluidity, the Christian empire did change things fundamentally. Christianity marked the end of a long period during which many respectable thinkers had explored radical ideas about the nature of the gods, even to the point of dismissing them altogether. Pre-Christian atheism was certainly not uncontroversial, and there were periods of severe repression. But as a rule, polytheism, the belief in many gods, was infinitely more hospitable toward disbelievers than monotheism. Under Christianity, by contrast, There was no good way of being an atheist. Atheism was the categorical rejection of the very premise on which Christians defined themselves. This book thus represents a kind of archaeology of religious skepticism. It is in part an attempt to excavate ancient atheism from underneath the rubble heaped on it by millennia of Christian opprobrium. But there is topsoil to dig through too, of a very different kind. In 18th and 19th century Europe, the formative era for modern atheism, classical learning was ubiquitous, among the educated at least. In that period, those who campaigned for a world without gods could appeal to the authority of Epicurus and Lucretius, or refer to Diagoras of Melos or Diagoras of Cyrene, in full confidence that they would be understood. Since the early 20th century, however, classical awareness has shrunk with alarming rapidity. Much of the blame for our collective blindness to the long history of atheism lies with an educational system that fails to acknowledge the crucial role of Greco-Roman thought in the shaping of Western secular modernity. This loss of consciousness of that classical heritage is what has allowed the modernist mythology to take root. It is only through profound ignorance of the classical tradition that anyone ever believed that 18th century Europeans were the first to battle the gods.